So I'm just going to talk to you today briefly about the National Investment Framework for Transport in Ireland, or as it's commonly referred to, Nifty. So next slide, please. So just to talk about, give a brief overview of the presentation. First of all, I'll just start off with an overview of what is Nifty, looking at its role, where it sits in the investment decision-making process, then talk a bit more details about how it's actually applied, looking at the investment priorities which it introduces and how these relate to the national strategic outcomes of the national planning framework, and then the modal and intervention hierarchies, which relate to option selection, and then digging down into these about how this actually works with other documents we have, such as our common appraisal framework, and a specific project-based example to try and kind of illustrate how the framework will work in practice, and then just look at how Nifty will continue to contribute towards an evidence base so that we continue to build our knowledge in this area, and then finally look at any questions you might have. So next slide, please. So firstly, what is Nifty? So Nifty is the Department of Transport's high-level strategic framework to support consideration and prioritization investment in the land transport network. So it's part of the government's Project Ireland 2040 vision. So in other words, it aligns with the national planning framework, and then underneath that, the national development plan, which was revised last year. And it's been developed to ensure that transport investment is aligned with the NPF's national strategic outcomes, as well as our other key commitments, which have been already articulated by some of my colleagues this morning, such as our decarbonisation commitments in the Climate Action Plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of what is the purpose of Nifty? So Nifty updates and replaces our previous Land Transport Investment Framework, which was the Strategic Investment Framework for Land Transport, or STILT, which was published in 2015. And so the reason for the need to update this is the investment context has changed considerably since then. Notably, when STILT was published, was immediately after the financial crisis. There was a severe constraint on economic resources, and so really the focus of that framework was on ensuring our maintenance investment and our steady state renewal of our existing transport assets, with little scope for new investment at the time. Also, because it was in 2015, it predates the publication of the National Planning Framework and the 2040 documents in 2018. And so essentially what Nifty does is it takes account of the new updated transport context, and then how it will actually look at implementing and delivering on the National Planning Framework 10 national strategic outcomes. But I'll talk about these in a bit more detail in just a moment. So next slide, please. So in terms of where Nifty sits in the overall investment decision-making process, so you can see at the top of this diagram here, we have the Project Ireland 2040 documents, the National Planning Framework, the National Development Plan, and they set out a set of 10 national strategic outcomes. So essentially Nifty does is it translates these into a transport investment specific context. So we heard the minister at the outset today talk about these national strategic outcomes and how he could distill these down. So that's essentially what Nifty is doing. It's distilling these requirements down into some core investment priorities for the transport sector. And I'll talk about these in detail in just a moment. And then they flow down, and at the strategic level, they're then to be implemented in a whole series of iterations of transport sectoral policy documents, and also metropolitan area transport strategies and regional planning documents, such as your own regional spatial economic strategy. And that's at a strategic level. Nifty also applies at a project level, and I'll talk about that, as I said, to a worked example towards the end of this presentation. So next slide, please. So it's also important to consider here, as much as what is the role of Nifty, to look at the considerations that lie outside of Nifty or that are beyond Nifty, outside of its scope. So firstly, focusing on the green box here on the left. So what is the role of the framework? So as I said, it establishes a set of investment priorities, and these will be key to making sure investment in the transport sector aligns with the goals of the national planning framework. And then future transport and sectoral strategies, and as I said, metropolitan area transport strategies, for example, will then have to align with these investment priorities that Nifty sets out. And then at the individual project level, it sets out in these investment hierarchies, modal and intervention hierarchies, which relate then to the investment priorities as well. And these will have to be implemented at the individual project level when people look at is an individual project aligned with the Nifty investment priorities, and how has the option selection process been carried out? Does it align with these hierarchies? But as I said, again, we'll talk about that through a worked example at the end. But then it's also worth looking here at considerations that lie outside of Nifty. So Nifty, it's important to state, does not identify specific projects or determine the total amount of transport funding available or decide on its allocation in individual funding areas. These investment decisions will continue to be guided by wider priorities and sectoral strategies, so including things like our climate action plan, which sets our decarbonisation commitment, our rural future, and the forthcoming sustainable mobility policy, which Garrett spoke about towards the start of today. And then it's also crucial to note that investment decisions will continue to be guided and reflect the priorities of the program for government. So this is things like an annual investment of 360 million in active travel, or the 2-to-1 ratio of new investment in public transport compared to new roads projects. But again, these are considerations that take place outside Nifty, these total transport investment decisions. So next slide, please. So I'd spoken already a little bit about the national strategic outcomes of the national planning framework, and the minister also spoke about these a little bit in his introduction. See, here they are here. There's 10 of them in total, and we can see some of these are clearly linked to transport. For example, for sustainable mobility, to enhanced regional accessibility, it's clear to see they have a clear focus and link to our transport sector. But other ones are also equally importantly related to transport. These are things like strengthening our rural economies and communities, achieving compact urban growth within our towns and cities, and then also crucially, number 8, a transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy and society. And so it won't be possible to achieve these national strategic outcomes without delivering in the transport sector. And so essentially, what we've attempted to do through Nifty is, through extensive research, look at how we can deliver a set of investment priorities in the transport sector which aligns with and achieves these NSOs. So next slide, please. So having spoken about that, we take these 10 national strategic outcomes, and then through detailed research, which began in 2019 and took the form of 14 background papers, which looked at our current transport network and also projections for our future transport network, we arrived at these 4 investment priorities. And you can see these are mobility of people and goods in urban areas, protection and renewal investment, enhanced regional and rural connectivity, and decarbonisation. And so it's important to note here that these investment priorities have not been ranked, because just as achieving the 10 national strategic outcomes will be key to arriving at the overall economy and society we want to live in 2040, achieving each one of these investment priorities will be key in getting the transport sector to align with those overall goals. So for example, a large change from SFILT in 2015 was it put a large emphasis on protection and renewal investment. And that's still reflected here. We can see that protection renewal is still one of the investment priorities. However, it's also recognized that we have to achieve other priorities such as decarbonisation in order to arrive at the transport sector that we want. And new projects, when they're proposed for investment, will have to be seen to align with at least one of these investment priorities. So next slide, please. So in addition to the investment priorities, Nifty also introduces a set of modal and intervention hierarchies, which are intended to support option development at the individual project level. So we can see here, first of all, we have the modal hierarchy, and this says, all else being equal, that we should look to promote and accommodate, encourage active travel first, so walking and cycling, then look at public transport solutions, and then finally look at ones which are more reliant on private vehicles. And again, these modal and intervention hierarchies are intended to be pragmatic rather than rigid frameworks. So for example, it's recognized some transport challenges some solutions won't be as appropriate to address certain challenges. For example, if you have the need to connect to major urban centers, then active travel is unlikely on its own to be able to achieve that need. So it's pragmatic, and but it does help the option consideration process when you're looking at individual projects. So I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. So then the second hierarchy is an intervention hierarchy. And again, this looks at trying to make sure the investments that we make in the transport sector are the most proportionate to the problem which we've identified. So it essentially says that all else being equal, we should look to maintain existing assets, then to optimize assets, and make improvements to the existing network, and only then, after we've exhausted these other considerations, should we look at providing entirely new infrastructure. And again, this is makes sense from a cost effectiveness point of view, trying to get the most value from our existing assets, and it also makes sense in terms of it aligns also with just a sense in terms of trying to make the best use of what we already have. So I'll talk through now in the next slide about what exactly we're talking about under as examples of interventions under each one of these tiers. So the next slide, please. So if we look at maintenance, so again, that's all maintenance, say, for example, on our national road network, it's maintenance spending there. It also looks at spending for climate resilience measures. If we looked at optimization, that looks at interventions such as demand management, also park and ride, or electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Those would all be examples of how we would optimize our existing assets. If we look at improvement, these are more targeted improvements of our existing assets. So things such as electrifying our existing rail lines or making targeted road safety improvements to the existing road network. And then finally, new is fairly self-explanatory. This should be the last one considered, and this is entirely new infrastructure, so potentially a new road, or adding another carriageway to a road, adding another rail line. And again, you can see that it makes sense that we would consider initially improvements or optimizations to our existing network before we consider outright new infrastructure. So next slide, please. So then in terms of how is this all going to be implemented at the individual project level, which I'm sure is what a lot of you will be concerned about today. So it's just worth stating at the outset that there's a suite of appraisal documents. There's a public spending code, which sets the national guidance in terms of making sure projects comply with best practice, provide value for money. And then we have a transport specific guidance provided by the Common Appraisal Framework. And so essentially Nifty does is it provides guidance on, it will be implemented through the CAF, through an update of the Common Appraisal Framework. And now that's planned for later this year, probably about Q2 later this year. And so in the interim, we also have interim guidance, which will be published very shortly, which will instruct individual local authorities on how exactly they're meant to apply the investment priorities and the modal intervention hierarchies at an individual business case level when they apply for funding. And essentially, it relates to two aspects: strategic alignment, which says that a business case must demonstrate that it meets at least one of the Nifty investment priorities in order to be approved for funding. And then also, in terms of the option selection, has to be developed within the framework of the two hierarchies. And as I said, we'll talk about this through a specific example shortly. But again, it's important to note that the hierarchies themselves are principle-based tools rather than strict rules. So we, as I said, we note that some projects will require different solutions, and it won't be a fixed approach. So next slide, please. So as I said, we already have, and local authorities or consultants who prepare business cases on their behalf will already be aware of their requirements under the Public Spending Code and of the Common Appraisal Framework. And so it's important to note that Nifty doesn't introduce a whole raft of new requirements. Rather, it tries to take existing requirements and make them a bit more refined to align with the goals that we're trying to achieve in the transport sector. So you can see the column on the left here is existing requirements that a business case or strategic assessment report, when it's sent in for funding, is required to include. And on the right is what Nifty will require in addition in these individual sections. So for example, on the objectives must be seen now to align with one of the Nifty investment priorities. On strategic alignment, it must state that the exact purpose and link it back to these objectives and how it's going to interact with the NSOs and the Nifty investment priorities. And then in the long listing process of options, it's important that when you're considering option development, that we work through the tiers of the hierarchies and consider the most sustainable and most proportionate solution to a given transport problem first, before looking at solutions relying, for example, on private car, or solutions that require outright new investment. That's not saying that we'd never have these solutions. It's just saying that when we develop options, it's important that we consider all available options for intervention under the hierarchies first. And so then if we go to the next slide. So then looking at how this would apply in practice. So this is just a very high level worked example. So it's worth pointing out at the outset, which I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of, that the Department of Transport typically is an approving authority, and so wouldn't be developing the business cases themselves. Rather, that would be carried out either by local authorities, consultants on their behalf, or then for larger projects by TII or the NTA. But this is just, as I said, an illustrative example. So if we look at here, first of all, what's our problem definition? So the problem that this intervention is trying to address is high levels of congestion in a large town due to HGV through traffic to access a nearby port. So if we look at the objective, so one of the objectives of this scheme, or a key one, is to reduce congestion levels in the town and associated greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see straight away that that relates to two key Nifty investment priorities, which can be set out in the strategic alignment section of the business case, which is decarbonization. So clearly, we want to remove HGV traffic to encourage active travel and to encourage more sustainable mobility. So we can relate that back to decarbonization. Also, mobility of people and goods in urban areas. So reduction in congestion will also support this aim. So then if we work through the two hierarchies, so we look first of all at the modal hierarchy, we look at active travel first. So we can say that active travel may help address some congestion issues. For example, new cycling or walking infrastructure might help in that regard, but it won't remove HGV traffic. And in fact, HGV traffic continuing to access through the center of the town will present a danger to those using active travel. So we can say it probably isn't the primary solution here. Then moving on to public transport, we have a similar problem. It may address some of the congestion issues, but fundamentally HGVs will still be coming through the center of the town. So then we would then move down to private vehicles. So we'll have to look at potentially solutions which are more reliant on this space. Then moving over to the intervention hierarchy, we say that through maintenance, congestion is not an issue of a lack of maintenance, so we can quickly move down. Optimization, demand side measures and congestion charging may play a role here and may help, but again, this is high strategic value traffic, so it's not that we want to stop the HGVs making these journeys, it's just that we don't want them making through the urban center. Target improvements to the existing infrastructure are limited by the town footprint. So, for example, we can't widen the roads any further because of geographic constraints. And so then we might look at scope for new limited infrastructure around the town to move HGV traffic. And so working through this, what the solution that we might arrive at, or one potential option that we might look to pursue here, is a targeted bypass of the town, which diverts HGV traffic around it, and then facilitates active travel investment within the town center, which also facilitates compact urban growth. So you can see here how this would work in practice. Every business case will be a little bit different, have its own particularities, but this is how you might look in practice to implement the Nifty modal and intervention hierarchies. As I said, we will publish guidance very shortly, interim guidance before the Common Appraisal Framework is updated, about exactly how sponsoring agencies, those submitting projects, are intended to apply these different tools. So next slide, please. And then finally, just to note, as I said, Nifty was already supported by an extensive evidence base of 14 background papers, and will continue to carry out this research. So Nifty commits to 9 priority policy areas for further action and further development, and these include areas around supporting analysis on our decarbonization commitments. So, for example, looking at what's required in our electric vehicle infrastructure, urban congestion in our cities, the role of rail for freight and passenger transport, and protection and renewable infrastructure. And so continuing to build this evidence base will make sure that our transport investment decisions continue to be guided by the latest evidence in the area. All right, so next slide, please.